We're here, an honor to have the ambassador of the Philippines here with us today to talk a little bit about our bilateral relationship, as well as a little bit about the nature of leadership in the world today that's needed to solve some of the big problems we face. Let me begin by asking you a little bit about your career. I see that you attended Wharton Business School here in the United States, but you're here as a diplomat.
Yes.
How did this come about?
First, let me thank you, Ambassador, for this opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. In response to your question, I actually spent most of my career in the business sector, except for 7.5 years that I spent as a public servant right after the People Power Revolution, when the dictator was driven out of government by the people, a peaceful people power
This is after
revolution.
the Marcos.
After Marcos, President Corazon Aquino assumed the presidency, and I was invited to join her government. And I started as head of the Social Security system, which was one of the 5 government-controlled corporations, but probably the only one that had any money left after the Marcoses had, pillared the other financial institutions. And after 4 years as head of the Social Security system, the President asked me to assume the governorship of the Central Bank of the Philippines. So I spent another 2 years under her, of course, leadership. And then President Ramos took over in 1992. We had an election, and therefore he asked me to stay on for another 1.5 years as governor of the Central Bank. Then I rejoined the private sector as head of AIG's life insurance subsidiary in the Philippines, which is the largest life insurance insurance company in the country. So after I retired in 2009, I was invited by the current Foreign Affairs Secretary, Secretary Albert Dosai, who was also ambassador to the U.S. For about 5 years during the term of President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo. So I had no intentions of becoming a diplomat, but he convinced me to take this post in Washington because of my business background. He said, we'd like to promote economic diplomacy, and your background would be very helpful. Your, of course, network in the U.S. will also be very useful for the job you're going to assume.
I would imagine that serving as ambassador from the Philippines in Washington is probably the most important, or one of the most important diplomatic assignments for...
Yes, it is the most important diplomatic post for the Philippines because of our bilateral relations with the U.S., the economic relationship that we have had with the U.S. for the last maybe 6-7 decades since we assumed our independence. The U.S. continues to be one of our major trading partners, the second largest actually trading partner. So we have, of course, a strategic defense and security alliance with the U.S. So undoubtedly the relationship between the Philippines and the U.S. would be the most important.
Is there, obviously the United States and the Philippines share a lot of history.
That's right.
And sometimes the history between, a Western power and perhaps, a country in the developing world that's had a history of governance at one point. Does that play in a positive way to cement the connection between the American people and government and the Philippine people, or is there still a legacy of perhaps trying to move out of America's shadow?
No, I think the relationship has been such that we acknowledge that we are a developing country looking to a partnership with a superpower, the U.S., and we have, of course, benefited in terms of the tremendous assistance that has been provided by the U.S. in terms of military and security, the economic assistance that we have received from the U.S., and of course the very robust people-to-people power, people-to-people relationships in both the U.S. and the Philippines. As you know, we have roughly about 3.5 million Filipino Americans who have contributed to American society. We have many leading medical professionals in the U.S. who have also made significant contributions to American society. And in the Philippines, we have over 300,000 Americans who are very much welcomed and appreciated by the Filipino people. So we have, of course, occasions where we have differences, but like partners, we're able to understand that we can't always agree on everything, but we're able to manage this occasional differences, and we agree to disagree.
So President Obama will be making his first trip to the Philippines next month, and there's probably many issues on the agenda, but what would be the sort of top three things that you hope that the President's visit can advance?
Well, of course, the visit will reaffirm the strong bilateral relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines. And I believe that the focus will be, one will be the military and security alliance that we have. We're currently negotiating what we call an enhanced defense cooperation agreement, which will be, of course, part of the visiting, or the underlying agreement to that is a visiting forces agreement that's currently existing. This was signed in 1999.
Was that part of the base closure, base transfer
That's right.
agreement?
When the bases were closed in 1992, in 1999, we forged a visiting forces agreement, which has as a basis the Mutual Defense Treaty Agreement signed in 1951.
Right.
So we're expanding that with this new agreement that will allow the U.S. forces access to certain military bases that are, of course, controlled by the armed forces of the Philippines. So the U.S. is not looking for any bases, but it is looking to have access, and this access can be very, very useful in times of, say, like a natural disaster that we had, Typhoon Haiyan, where the U.S. in fact had Marines on the ground maybe within 48 hours after typhoon, because they had redeployed some marine supplies and Marines who came from Okinawa, who were there as the first responders to that Typhoon Haiyan disaster. So that is one example where access.
So defense would be a principal agenda item for
Yes,
the
that's a major item. The economic. We're hoping that by the time the president comes, that agreement would have been concluded and hopefully signed when the president visits. So that's the first one. Of course, we're saying that it's not just the military and security aspect of the relationship. There's also the economic aspect, and we're trying to.
The TPP, for example.
The TPP, we're hoping to get assistance from the U.S. in terms of the negotiations that we will have to undergo. So even at this point, there are preliminary consultations with the USTR and other U.S. agencies by our own departments of trade and industry and other agencies.
Have you had a chance to work with the Vice President at all? Vice President Biden? Not
No,
as much.
well, we've really focused on the State Department,
Yeah.
Defense, and also Department of Commerce. We're hoping that Secretary Pritzker may be visiting in the Philippines, hopefully sometime middle of this year. We're also trying to get the U.S. ASEAN Business Council is arranging a high-level business delegation to the Philippines, and we're hoping that Secretary Pritzker may in fact head that delegation.
That would be important. What sectors are the is American industry most involved in the Philippines?
Well, the American companies that have been there have been very, very successful. So if you look at, say, Procter & Gamble has been there 77 or 78 years, IBM, maybe close to 100 years, Citibank, certainly close to 100 years, Chevron, so many, they're in various sectors. But the more recent, maybe in the last 5 years, it's in the business process outsourcing
Right.
industry.
Right.
Because of the call center operation. The Philippines is now #1 globally, and many of the U.S. corporations do have call center operate, particularly the banks, the credit card companies like American Express. So that sector has seen quite a number of American companies, but we are trying to attract more companies into manufacturing, although of course we recognize that's a challenge because here the U.S. government is also encouraging the American companies to do more manufacturing here in the U.S. rather than abroad.
Right.
We're seeing, however, companies from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and other coming to the Philippines because we provide some very attractive advantages, not just tax holidays, but also we have a highly educated labor force that speaks English, and they can be, of course, recruit at very reasonable costs. So we provide this kind of, they're highly trainable, and they have demonstrated that they can meet the highest international standards. So we are trying to attract more companies, more American companies, particularly in the infrastructure sector, because we do have tremendous need for new airports,
Right.
seaports. The economy has been growing very rapidly. The last 2 years have been
I've seen that
tremendous.
very, very fast.
We
growth
had a
rate.
GDP growth rate of 6.8% in 2012 and 2013. We had a 7.2%, which was the highest in Southeast Asia, and second only to China's 7.7% in 2013. The IMF, the World Bank, and the ADB are projecting continued rapid growth of the Philippine economy. And because of that, we will, of course, need more energy, and this is why we're happy that AES, one of the largest U.S. power companies, has expanded their operations in
It's a
the Philippines.
local company too. Washington.
Yes.
Has a Washington connection. Yeah.
Right. They're in Virginia.
Yeah,
no?
Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're quite happy about that, but we still need more power companies to come into the country because the demand is going to increase quite substantially over the next, say, 5 to 10 years.
What do you attribute, is there something you can point to that's responsible for that growth rate surge? Is
Well, there
it
are really three
more
reasons.
political stability?
Yeah.
Or?
Good governance was one, because, of course, in the past, corruption was one of the major challenges. But with the good governance program adopted by President Aquino, I think there's been big turnaround. It has inspired confidence in the country and in the leadership of our country. Strong macroeconomic fundamentals would be another factor for this rapid growth. The third would be that the government itself has been increasing its investments into infrastructure. For a long time, the Philippines was not investing sufficiently in infrastructure, and that has been one of the drawbacks.
We know that problem in the United States as
Right.
well.
From 1% of GDP, the president plans to increase it to 5% of GDP, which is the norm suggested by the World Bank and by the IMF. So we're probably at 3.2% now, and we hope that by the end of this year we'll be at 4%, and by 2016 we'll be at 5%. So from about 200 billion pesos, we'll be seeing our budget for infrastructure rising to about 800 billion by 2016. So tremendous expansion. And this is why I said there are tremendous opportunities for American companies to look at infrastructure, energy, water, airports, seaports, and so on.
Representative in Washington, D.C. deal with many stakeholders. You have the executive branch, the legislative branch, civil society, the NGO sector.
That's right.
How do you manage your time in this job? Obviously, Congress, given the amount of power it has over fiscal issues, is important.
Yeah. Well, first I'd say you have to be flexible, because sometimes I have to see 4 or 5 legislators within a day, and many times they change. You have to be flexible enough to adapt. If they say, well, unfortunately we have a vote, so can you please come an hour later or 2 hours later? So of course you've got to be flexible, as I said. But I think I'm fortunate that we have also very good people at the embassy who I can rely on. I cannot meet everyone, so sometimes I would delegate this responsibility to my deputy chief of mission or to some of our ministers who would be able to tackle the issue. But of course, for the more important issues, I attend to them myself. So, meetings with the State Department, the Pentagon, in Congress, I have to be the one to do that.
And how much have you traveled around the United States in
Quite
your
a bit,
in your
because
current
we have,
capacity?
Yeah, we have a large Filipino American community in the U.S. As I mentioned earlier, 3.4, 3.5 million, but the concentration is of the Filipino Americans is in California. It's the largest concentration with 1.4 million, and then of course Hawaii would be second with about 340,000. I've been to 28 states so far.
Terrific.
And I hope to visit even more in the next year or two. So it's a challenge, but having been in the private sector, I've learned time management is very critical. So I have learned some very valuable lessons.
Do you find that Americans outside the Beltway have a different view of issues?
Oh yes, definitely.
They do.
I guess depends on which state you go to. You can see very different perspectives, whether it's Washington, New York, LA, San Francisco, the Midwest, very, very different.
Yeah. So what about exports from the Philippines to the U.S.? What are the sectors that are the most?
First, let me say that we have a fairly balanced trade with the U.S. And while we enjoy a slightly favorable balance of trade surplus, it's not, I mean, the deficit that the US has is not as huge as it has with other countries in Asia. And I won't mention the other countries, I'm sure you know which I'm speaking to. So, speaking about, we export a lot of electronics and electronic parts. We export agricultural products. Sugar is, we're the third largest exporter of sugar to the US. We also export coconut and coconut products, coconut water.
That's a growing
Oh, yes,
beverage
yes.
choice for many.
That's right, because it's a healthy drink. Coconut water has become very, very popular over the last maybe 3 years. From about 1 million liters, we were exporting 1 million liters about 3 years ago. I think now we're about 3 or 4 million liters. And we hope that it will increase further. So our two-way trade increased from 13 billion in 2009 to 22 billion dollars. As I said, we have a slightly favorable balance of trade surplus. We import a lot of, say, wheat from the U.S., meat. We also import, of course, parts for electronics, and we're trying to expand, of course, the market of our agriculture product. For example, we started exporting bananas, and we hope to be able to export even more because the first shipment of bananas, I think, was very well received in the California area. So they're starting in California, but we hope to also export to the East Coast.
So the World Economic Forum is going to hold its Asia regional meeting in Manila in May. The Asian Development Bank is headquartered in Manila.
Right.
Do you think that Manila can become sort of a bridge or a hub of activity that connects the United States into Asia, but also as a place to locate these important convening activities?
I'm glad you asked that question. Yes, in fact, I've been saying that the U.S. firms can use the Philippines as a platform to access other ASEAN countries. Because of our strategic location, the U.S. can use the Philippines as its base or as a platform to access the other ASEAN countries. As you know, the ASEAN Economic Community will be integrated hopefully by the end of 2015. That's the target anyway. And that would then allow firms, U.S. firms that are operating in Saudi to export anywhere within the ASEAN region on a duty-free basis.
Great.
They are already doing that. For example, the auto firms that are based in Thailand, when they export, let's say, the cars to the Philippines made in Thailand, they come in duty-free. But with this integrated ASEAN Economic Community, it's going to allow free flow of goods, labor, and so on.
In addition to its long-standing work in promoting diplomacy and exchange of culture and people, Meridian's Global Leadership Institute is looking at how to prepare leaders in the public and the private sector to operate in an international environment. You've served in both the private sector and the public sector and have been global your whole career.
Yeah.
But given your experience, what are the things, the essential approaches or skills that you think are needed today to be effective?
First, let me congratulate Meridian for the great work you've been doing in terms of diplomacy and, of course, in terms of developing leaders for the public and private sector. In terms of leadership, well, I guess one that is very important for us, you mentioned earlier, time management has to be, I guess, one of the skills that someone who's going to be an effective diplomat will have to develop. But it's also important for someone who is in diplomacy to be a good listener, because a diplomat like myself, I I learn a lot from my own colleagues, from my colleagues in ASEAN, and as well as my other colleagues in the diplomatic community. So learning is very important. But one of the, I guess, advantages I have, and I think it's becoming even more important in today's environment, is understanding the business. Because diplomats, both in the US and the Philippines, are now being asked to promote economic diplomacy. I recall Secretary Clinton asked all the US ambassadors to come back to Washington to have I think it was a seminar on understanding how business operates, because she was encouraging them to promote
So it's a sort of
business
economic
opportunities.
statecraft
Yeah, in the
agenda.
U.S. And Secretary Kerry is doing the same thing. Our own Foreign Affairs Secretary also did the same thing, got all our ambassadors to come back to Manila and to go through a seminar at the Asian Institute of Management. So that, I think, has become very important in today's environment.
Mr. Ambassador, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Meridian and the diplomatic career for your time. We know that you mentioned time management.
Yes.
We were glad that public diplomacy and economics and
Yes.
security were able to come together in our discussion today.
Yes.
And we wish you good luck, and we really strongly appreciate the historic connection that the U.S. has with the Philippines. It's a special and important relationship.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure chatting with you,
Thank you.
Ambassador Holliday. Thank you. And thank you to Meridian.
Thank you.